As I've touched upon before, folk, there's always the question of scale when it comes to economics and politics.
In a lot of ways, America is a strangely right-wing country. No universal health care, no universal child care, poor labor protections. Everyone knows this. But why is that? Well, if you look at American history, you actually find a pretty interesting reason. Unlike other industrialized countries, America never really had a powerful socialist movement.
Like I say, American history isn't black and white. The argument between capitalism and socialism even goes as far back as its foundations, between the argument of the Jeffersonian America and Hamiltonian America. For those of you who don't understand, Alexander Hamilton was the founder of cronyism in the United States of America. He was the one who argued in the Constitutional Convention in 1787 for a strong, powerful legislator, and the people would just basically be peasants. So in other words, it was much like that of King George III, that type of British style mercantilism. He was not in favour of what the Constitution would be. Now, of course, he was the one who contributed to the Federalist Papers, which is a collection of 81 papers that was passed forth for ratification in 1788, and that would be what would become the American Constitution. Over the whole argument, whether it was going to be the Jeffersonian America or the Alexander Hamiltonian America, and Abraham Lincoln being influenced by the likes of Henry Clay, he was someone who was strongly in favour of this, the American economy, and the influence that Abraham Lincoln had. His main agenda for 30 odd years, right up to when he became the President of the United States, wasn't really about letting slaves free. That was never his main agenda, nor was it, protecting the Union. His agenda was more or less down to that of the American economy, to do with British style mercantilism, and that's what you've seen ever since Abraham Lincoln's takeover. Creeping corporatism that you would see for 50 years onwards that led to the rise of the Federal Reserve, more and more socialism introduced into the economy.
Compare that to Europe. In the 19th and 20th centuries, every country in Europe saw a huge socialist party develop. The Social Democratic Party in Germany, the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, the Socialist Party in Belgium. In countries like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, parties with socialist roots governed for decades.
What she doesn't tell you is the socialism that ripped the arse right out the British economy. Like I've stated before, folk, prior to Margaret Thatcher, we faced the winter of discontent in 1978. We were known as the sick man of Europe by 1974, and that was all because of their heavy nationalisation or their socialism, running the printing press that created the very problem in the absence of free market money. The most damaging thing about socialism isn't so much just its failure, it's the in denial of its failure, and I know that first on, and yet she's preaching about socialism here in Britain. You Americans would have first on experience with that state run services. Just take for example the USPS, the US Postal Service, dumping mail in the trucks, leaving it there as it would avoid being labelled as delayed, undelivered mail for months.
Now, none of these countries ever became fully socialist. Instead, socialist parties and their allies built well-functioning social democratic institutions.
The heavy socialism that was in Sweden tore the arse out them. Between 1870 to 1960s, I've touched upon before, in their free market era, they boomed and became the fourth richest nation per capita GDP in the world, due to capitalism making them wealthy. That's what socialism was feeding off of, because socialism is a parasite. Socialism doesn't create wealth. Through the heavy nationalisation, heavy government regulation, and all the higher tax rates, it ripped the arse right out of Sweden, and before you know it, by the early 90s, they plunged into a crisis.
It's what they called the European way. Universal health care, generous welfare programs, free education, and strong protections for labor.
The free education and free health care and free prescriptions and free tuition fees and So the reason why I laugh at that is because of the fact that I graduated in photography. When it came to the decision whether I wanted to go and do the degree at university, there's only 11 placements available for each university. Why do you think there's only 11 placements available despite high demand? Well, given the fact that they had to cut back in order to compensate paying for all their socialist pish and the so-called free tuition fees and all the rest of this pish. They don't understand what the free means. It's like they don't understand the broken window fallacy. I mean, if they're so wealthy, why aren't they financing it completely themselves? Why are they getting the United States of America in order to pay for all their, socialist pish?
But that sort of transformation never happened in the United States. Now, to be fair, the US did see a fairly strong progressive movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There was the Working Man's Party of the 1870s, the governments of Radical Reconstruction, which W.E.B. Du Bois called dictatorships of the proletariat, and the leftist Populist Party, which won 5 states in 1892. There were even 2 members of the Socialist Party elected to Congress, and in 1912, Eugene Debs, the socialist presidential candidate, received a full 6% of the national popular vote. The American Socialists were successful enough that in 1906, the leader of the German Social Democratic Party predicted that Americans will be the first to usher in a socialist republic. So why did the American left never gain power like the European left did? There are a few schools of thought about this. The most famous view, that of the German economist Werner Sombart, suggests that Americans were too prosperous and wealthy to believe in socialism. All socialist utopias, he said, came to nothing on roast beef and apple pie.
Because they weren't desperate, and that's the difference between that of the likes of the Weimar Republic, the collapse and the hyperinflation it caused, and you see Austria that was in desperate state. That's the only reason why they viewed Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany as their saviour. Socialism wasn't properly tried and tested until about 1917, when eventually they came with the rise of the Soviet Union and then Nazi Germany, for example.
But my socialism is all about workers' ownership. How can you call Nazi Germany socialist?
They weren't to know what was going to come in history. They didn't know what was going to happen with Adolf Hitler and the millions being killed or whatnot. And the Soviet Union was still to come to power, etc. Obviously, they're going to, be sympathetic of socialism at that time. That was, of course, until the socialist regimes followed, and the socialists proudly called themselves socialists in Nazi Germany until the millions were being killed, and then they started to distance themselves.
Socialism needed workers to live close together to form working-class institutions. It could do that in places like Berlin or London or Paris, but not so much in sprawling America. Even as the country urbanized in the 20th century, it also suburbanized. Suburban sprawl promoted anonymity and atomization, rather than the sense of community and solidarity that socialism needs to take root.
Let's all hold hands together and sing Kumbaya, and let's all just, all be living happy ever after, and let's just ignore the real world and ignore all the dangers, and it's all for the sake of solidarity. Solidarity. We're all equal.
Folk, we are not equal, and the whole thing about the solidarity and the usual pish they hit out with about this community spirit, how the hell do they then explain the single parent households that were caused through all of that of their welfare statism then? That's exactly what destroyed the community spirit, because people then thought to themselves, oh well, the state will just do it for me. And the state was actually creating and rewarding incentives for single parent households. It created that problem, it created division. Hardly a case of solidarity. Solidarity.
Denser places like the Lower East Side of New York, at one point the most densely populated place on Earth, were hubs of socialism and radicalism of all shades. But the vast majority of places weren't like that. And the fact that there was so much land also meant that workers were constantly moving in search of better jobs. As late as the 1960s, about 20% of Americans moved every year. That rate of moving was way higher than in most European countries.
No wonder folk were moving so much, probably because of the fact there was no jobs left. There's issues where certain folk, and they go to study in a specific place and they have to move and they've got no choice. Maybe they go to a certain university, maybe it's something to do with the US military or something else. Rent controls, or if it wasn't rent controls, it was the minimum wage laws, etc., destroying jobs, employment, etc., problems in the job market and the inflationary problems that they created. I mean, they were running the printing press during this time period. Inflation spiralling out of control and all sorts, plunging towards near enough a second Great Depression because of their false prosperity of the 1960s.
Another source of division was occupation. Early attempts to form unifying working class organizations across different levels of skill, like the Knights of Labor in the 1880s, were destroyed by state terror and repression. There were also cultural and political distinctions that made building a party of the working class impossible.
Capitalists are within the right to protect their own private business, just like what you saw with the Pinkertons hired to protect, and the strikers had actually prevented the workers who weren't striking from being able to work. They used violence to take over and theft. The reason why strikes came around is simply because of the fact there was growth there to begin with. Let's imagine for a second you go back before the Industrial Revolution. Was there any strikes then? Why was there no strikes? It's because of the fact that there was no growth. Everybody was equally poor, so of course there's going to be no demand for, strikes. The average real wage earning growth rate in the United States was continuously increasing 1.6% per year on average. So although it was a slow real wage earning growth rate, it still doesn't hide the fact there was growth. So yes, I can understand their frustration. The whole reason for why you were seeing an improvement in wages to begin with was the competitive labour market. She seems to think it was to do with the labour unions.
The fact that America had universal or near universal male suffrage at a relatively early date, decades before the United Kingdom, prevented voters from polarizing on class lines. That's part of why, in the 19th and 20th centuries, many of the most dedicated socialists in America were Europeans importing socialist traditions from their home countries. It's no surprise that socialism tended to be strongest in immigrant communities, among Germans, Scandinavians, and Finns in the Midwest, and among Jewish immigrants in New York.
And how the hell did that turn out in Europe? Well, look at the Europeans. They know so much better than us Americans. It's like, the Europeans, because they love their socialism. Yeah, they love their socialism so much they were fleeing their own country.
And all of these difficulties in building a broad-reaching socialist coalition were compounded by the structure of American politics. Even today, think about how many times you've seen a friend on social media begging people not to vote third party because it will take away votes from another candidate. And this difficulty was made worse by the brutal repression of socialists, violence by state troops and private police forces against unions in the 19th and 20th centuries, the first Red Scare of 1919 to 1920, which saw many radicals jailed or deported, and then the second Red Scare of the 1950s, which saw socialists and communists blacklisted and fired.
After seeing what we saw of socialism of the Soviet Union, one of the most horrific, evil regimes the world has ever seen on this planet Earth that you would have to be a complete psychopath in order to even sympathise with. I mean, what you try to tell me? You try to say that those totalitarian regimes were freer than the United States of America? If that was the bloody well case, then why were hundreds and thousands of people in Cuba trying to escape Cuba for the shores of Florida?
Even now, people who consider themselves communists are banned from immigrating to the United States. But the question isn't really why America never became a socialist country. After all, neither did any of those European countries. The real question is why, after the Democratic Party briefly became a social democratic party in the 1930s and 40s, America has been without any party pushing not just socialism, but any sort of redistribution to help ordinary people.
The welfare state covers that anyhow, but in terms of the redistribution of wealth that goes to the hands of the special interest groups through government subsidies, etc., that is socialism, it's collectivism, it's subordinating the individual rights and liberty of the individuals, forcing society into a collective group to collectively pay for the losses of others.
That is the most bizarre absent feature of America. But of course, history isn't destiny. Denied opportunity their whole lives, forced into dead-end jobs, facing mountains of debt and grim prospects.
That's rather quite funny, that is. It was your socialism that took away the free market money, and we were imposed a currency upon the market that the market didn't ask for. A currency that basically had nothing backing it until the 1970s, until it was backed by the petrodollar. It was through the running the printing press that created an inflationary problem, all the deficit spending, etc. How the hell can you sit there and complain when it was your socialism that's responsible for all of that?
More and more Americans, especially young ones, are identifying as socialists.
That's because they're young, they're naive, and if they understand that money only comes from two places, the private sector or the printing press, they would then accept and understand the reason why socialism is a failure. How the hell do you expect to operate and finance an economy off the back of the printing press? You having a laugh? Anyway, folk, if you've got anything you would like to add in yourself, any questions like that, comment in the comment section below. Be sure to like the video and share the video. And of course, thank you for watching. I'll be sure to get back to you. Cheers.